It's no secret that the job market is going through a bit of a wobble at the moment. Hiring has fallen to its lowest levels since 2011. There was zero job growth over the last 6 months, and more people are being forced into the gig economy. And yet the people who seem to be getting hit worst of all are, you guessed it, young people. In the UK, it was recently revealed that 1.2 million fresh graduates were applying for just 17,000 open vacancies, equivalent to 140 people per posting, with a similar situation unfolding across the pond, as 2/3 of all entry-level jobs are now filled by people with over 7 years of experience. We all know the days of simply dressing up in your best suit and handing your CV to the CEO of the company simply doesn't cut it. And there's always a tendency for each generation to feel like they are the ones that are uniquely disadvantaged compared to the ones before them. But what's actually happening now is very different to a simple temporary hiring shock. We're looking at a situation where these entry-level jobs may just cease to exist. Each time this has happened before, job loss in one sector has always led to more job creation in another. The loom replaced the hand weaver, but it created the factory worker. The spreadsheet replaced the bookkeeper, but it created the analyst. But what happens if those entry-level jobs simply disappear and nothing replaces them? For decades now, Western societies have been built on a pretty basic social contract. If you work hard enough, you'll have a better life than your parents, and a massive element underpinning that was unsurprisingly a college degree. For most of the 21st century, people with these degrees could expect to earn around 70% more than everybody else. Now, it's been clear for a while that this blanket promise was broken, and as far back as 1983, recruiters were already telling the New York Times that good grades alone weren't enough. They wanted work experience, leadership roles, extracurriculars, but even then, the assumption still remained that if you studied something practical, you'd still be fine. Except even that isn't true anymore. Computer science and engineering grads now face some of the highest levels of unemployment amongst recent graduates. So if even the safe bets aren't paying off anymore, something more fundamental has to be going on. Since the first AI models came out to the public 3 years ago, CEOs have been talking non-stop about how they expect the vast majority of white-collar jobs to disappear entirely. Now, ignoring the pretty obvious conflict of interest here, there is some reason to be concerned. If an automated agent can perform basic tasks for a fraction of the price of a white-collar worker, then many firms will just stop hiring them altogether. But despite all the hype and general fear-mongering around AI at the moment, the strange thing is, at least on the surface, people aren't getting replaced. Overall rates of unemployment for people with college degrees has barely changed since 2022, rising by only 1%, which rather bizarrely means that college graduates today are more likely to have a job than they were in 2015. A full 7 years after the economic crisis. That said, if you happen to be a recent grad, then you'll know that your entire outlook right now feels like a bit of a shit show. The average grad has to send out hundreds of applications just to land a single interview. Internships, which used to be a nice to have on your CV, have basically become a non-negotiable prerequisite for entry-level jobs. And to be fair, the consequences of this are actually starting to show up in the data. Over the past couple of years, rates of unemployment amongst people who have just graduated in the last few years has been steadily rising. For pretty much the first time in decades, this group's rate of unemployment is actually higher than that of the average worker. Now, that might seem like a bit of a contradiction. After all, college-educated workers aren't struggling to find jobs. So if the need for skilled, highly educated workers hasn't actually changed that much, then why would recent graduates have a hard time finding a job? Well, it all comes down to how the firms themselves are structured. For most of the 21st century, businesses looked something like this: executives at the top, managers in the middle, and entry-level workers at the base. These were typically people at the early stages of their careers, processing data, drafting reports, building Excel models, and aligning logos on PowerPoints, the kind of job that college graduates were perfectly suited to doing. Now, businesses have been run this way for such a long time that it's kind of hard to imagine anything different. But in the grand scheme of things, it's actually a relatively recent invention. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the dominant model was something known as a craftsman's workshop, where a master, a couple of journeymen, and a few apprentices would all work in a partnership to produce a specific set of goods in what was effectively a flat organisation. It was only after a series of technological innovations allowed Henry Ford to invent the factory production system in the early 20th century that this really began to change. Because of how they were set up, you needed thousands of people doing narrow, repetitive tasks, a layer of foremen to supervise them, and then executives at the top. The point is, a series of dramatic technological changes fundamentally reshaped how organizations were structured, and today it looks like AI is causing the exact same thing. One person now with the right tools can do what would have taken a team of 5 people a couple years ago, so the need for people at the bottom of the pyramid has been massively reduced. What's interesting though is that the same isn't true at the top. AI is really good at generating a ton of options, but if you've ever pushed back on one of its answers, you'll know it has a tendency to become a bit of a sycophant and just agree with you, even when you're clearly wrong. It's also prone to occasionally making really obvious mistakes, all of which make human oversight all the more important. All of this is creating a new corporate structure, which looks less like a pyramid and more like a diamond. The executives are still there at the top, but instead of hundreds of college grads at the bottom, you have an expanded layer of middle managers, each running small teams massively augmented by AI. On the surface, this might seem like one of those uncomfortable but ultimately manageable consequences of technological change. Recent graduates make up a relatively small slice of the workforce, and a few extra people moving back in with their parents isn't going to tank the economy. And if we're being honest, it's not like all of this wasn't entirely unpredictable. For decades, way more people have been going to university than the economy actually needed. And it's now got to the point where skilled trades, like being a plumber or an electrician, are often being paid more than lawyers. And by the start of 2022, around 40% of UK graduates were working in jobs that didn't require degrees at all. It's a mismatch that was always going to cause problems eventually, and AI may just be the thing that finally forced the reckoning. If the result is that fewer people take on tens of thousands in debt for degrees that weren't going to pay off anyway, that might not be such a bad outcome. But this isn't just a story about graduates having a harder time finding work. The strange reality is that cutting costs on new graduate hires isn't actually in companies' long-term interests either. It's just that at an individual level, they don't really have much choice. That might sound counterintuitive, but these kinds of dynamics actually play out a lot in marketplace economies, and they're known as prisoner dilemmas. Imagine you've been given a group project where the grade you'll get is going to be shared equally between everyone. The best outcome for the group is obviously that everyone works hard, so you all get a good grade. But the best outcome for you individually is that if everyone else is already working hard and you do nothing, you'd be getting the same grade as everyone else for effectively zero effort. The problem is, when everyone in the group is doing that same calculation, you end up in a situation where nobody puts in the effort in the first place. The project is terrible and everyone gets a bad grade. And if you've ever done a university group project, you'll know that this basically happens every time. As menial as that example might seem, it's exactly what we're seeing play out amongst the biggest and most successful companies in the world right now. It starts with the basic fact that training a junior employee is expensive. Companies have to pay them a competitive salary while still training them on the job, and once they've been trained enough to actually provide value for the company, there's no guarantee they'll actually stick around. So the individually rational move for any company is to let everyone else train graduates, use AI to plug the gap in the short term, and then hire experienced people away from the companies that did invest. The problem is, if everyone is doing that, it means that in a couple decades' time, there won't be any people with the job experience required to fill those manager roles. Now, it's not exactly a big shocker that lots of middle management are essentially just corporate paper pushers. But even if you were to strip out every unnecessary layer of bureaucracy, the fundamental need doesn't go away. Someone still has to make judgment calls that AI can't. And ignoring this could have massive consequences for the broader economy. And studies have found that a 10% drop in the share of skilled workers reduces GDP growth by nearly a full percentage point every year. In the case of the US, that would mean by 2040 the country's GDP would be $3.5 trillion lower than currently projected. Of course, it's not like those middle of the pyramid jobs will disappear as the number of people able to find them shrinks. The demand for people who can actually do the jobs will only continue to grow. The thing is, the people who actually have the skills to do them will increasingly be the ones who didn't take the traditional routes to get there. Instead, they're likely to be people who've spent their 20s building something from scratch, something made way easier through leveraging AI. One of the main consequences of this structuring will be, you guessed it, rising inequality. When you strip away the entry-level pipeline, you're essentially left with 3 viable paths for a new graduate. The first is to be exceptional enough to land one of the vanishingly small number of roles that still exists. The second, as I mentioned, is to go build something on your own. And the third, of course, is to be lucky enough to be born into a family which is either extremely wealthy or extremely well connected. Or, well, both. But for the vast majority who don't have that, it'll be insanely difficult. It's gotten to the point now where a standard application to a mid-tier consulting firm now typically involves an online application, a high-view video interview, a written case study, a numerical reasoning test, a first-round interview, an assessment centre, and then a final partner interview. That's 7 stages just to be considered for an entry-level role. On average, UK employers received 140 applications per graduate vacancy in 2025, more than triple the ratio of 2002. There's a common saying about how AI is going to create a permanent underclass. And while that might be a slight exaggeration, I do think there is a grain of truth in it. Since the 2008 recession, various studies have looked into what the long-term impacts of graduating during that recession were on people's future prospects. Put more simply, how much did people's first years in work actually matter? What they found was that people graduating in a recession don't just end up with lower incomes, but higher rates of disability, fewer marriages, less financially stable partners, and fewer children. And remember, the conditions that recent graduates face today aren't actually all that different from what they were during the 2008 recession. Back then, their unemployment peaked at around 7%. Today, it's 5.7. The reason that these first years of a career matter so much, despite the work not really being that important, all comes down to a concept known as compounding returns. Imagine 2 people who start on an equal salary of $65,000 per year, with each one of them getting a 5% pay rise every single year. The person who manages to find a job straight out of college will, after a 40-year career, be making $457,000 a year. Meanwhile, the person who didn't manage to do this, so ended up starting their career 5 years later, will find their salary at the end of their career to be just $358,000, nearly $100,000 less. In total, missing out on just those 5 years will cost them almost $2 million over their lifetime. Of course, this model is a big oversimplification. In real life, you've got all sorts of things from layoffs to starting families, which can make career progression a whole lot more complicated. But the point is that time in the game in itself is a form of wealth. The earlier you start compounding your experience, the more every next year is worth. So missing out on those first couple years can actually have a massive impact. Now, just like the pending shortage in experienced middle managers, the most obvious consequence of this effect is just going to be rising inequality. However, there is actually a second, more subtle thing which may end up being more consequential. At the most basic level, to keep an economy running, it requires money to be constantly circulating between people. One person earns their wage, spends it, making someone else's income, who then spends it, and so on. The faster the money moves around the system, the more economic activity it generates. But the thing is, not everybody spends equal amounts of their incomes. Imagine if someone on a relatively low income found a $100 bill on the street. Chances are they'd spend almost all of it on rent, food, bills, and so on. Now, imagine if a multi-millionaire found that same $100 bill. There's a good chance that they'd end up saving it, simply because they don't have anything they really need to spend it on. Economists call this the marginal propensity to consume, and the basic theory is that the higher your income is, the less likely you are to spend each individual dollar that you earn. So when you have an economy where the level of inequality rises, you end up with less money circulating overall. The problem with that is that there's less and less money buying things, and there's also less money for businesses to take in profits, and crucially, for them to use to pay their workers. Now, this might all sound like a slightly far-fetched, if not abstract theory, but we've seen similar things happen before. Throughout the 1920s, the American economy exploded, but the gains flowed almost entirely to the top. By the late 1920s, the top 1% of households were taking home nearly a quarter of all income, which meant even though the economy looked healthy on the surface, the consumer base which was holding it together was quietly being hollowed out. By the end of the decade, it had reached its breaking point, and the economy was plunged into what would be one of the worst recessions ever. Now, it's obviously somewhat unlikely that the disappearance of grad jobs causes the next Great Depression, but at the same time, there's no denying that the effects of this will stretch far beyond the recent graduates. The labour market is going through one of the most significant structural shifts it's seen in decades, and as the returns on a degree continue to fall, while the cost of getting one inevitably stays stubbornly high, it seems pretty likely that fewer people will go altogether. But for the next decade or so, before these expectations have had time to adjust, graduates are probably going to have a harder time than most recent generations. That said, and maybe this is just naive optimism, I do think there are some reasons to be positive. The same forces that are closing off traditional routes are also making it easier than ever to build something for yourself, reach an audience, and develop real skills outside of any institution. If you're willing to think differently about what a career can look like, the timing might actually not be as bad as it seems.